are Dr. Jenny Liu and Jeff Renfro, who will focus on the work they've been doing on the state feasibility studies. Dr. Jenny Liu is the Assistant Director of the Northwest Economic Research Center and an Assistant Professor at PSU's School of Urban Studies and Planning. She received her bachelor's degree in economics from UC Berkeley, her master's and PhD in agricultural and resource economics, also from UC Berkeley. She is an environmental and resource economist with a focus on transportation economics. And then Jeff, who is going to follow her, is the senior economist for NERC, also, well, for the same organization. He received his bachelor's degree from Santa Clara University and his master's from PSU. He has managed economic impact and return on investment studies and is the co-author of the 2013 study, Carbon Tax and Shift, How to Make It Work for Oregon's Economy. Thank you both.
Great. Good evening, everyone. So we have been working for the past about a little bit more than 2 years on carbon tax for Oregon, and we're just about at the end of our most current study. But at this point, we haven't released that particular study, so look out for that in early December. But we are going to, the way that we're going to organize our time here is that we're going to present to you what we did in terms of an Oregon carbon tax for that we did last year, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about what we did following that study to make it better, more detailed, more in depth, so that everyone can, here in Oregon, can understand how it can actually really work for Oregon. So, so for our first study, what we started out to do was really to figure out, at a very broad level, take a preliminary look at what would a carbon tax look like for Oregon. So what we needed to figure out was what kinds of levels would we set it at, who would we be taxing, or what would we be charging that tax on, and also try to evaluate what are the economic impacts on various sectors because of that tax, as well as what does it do in terms of effectively reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And then we take a look at where do we want to use that money. So here you'll see this term repatriation, which is the word that we're using for how do we use that revenue back, how do we give it back to the Oregon economy. So Dr. Shurtz's introduction into the British Columbia carbon tax is a very good segue, because that was basically what we based the framework of what we saw as a carbon tax for Oregon. So we took a look at British Columbia, what they were doing. They are the most successful regional or provincial carbon tax that is taxed on a very broad basis at a reasonably high price. So we thought that that was a good starting point to go off of. So if we can go to the next slide. So just before we get into our analysis, one thing that's important to note here is where our carbon emissions are coming from, and how is Oregon employment distributed, basically. So on the left-hand side of the graph here, you'll see that more specifically for Oregon, most of our carbon emissions come from transportation, and then the rest is kind of spread out between residential, commercial, and industrial. So a little bit different than the previous graph table that you saw from Dr. Shurtz. So right off the bat, even without doing any analysis, you can see here that if we charge a carbon tax here in Oregon, transportation is going to be the sector that is going to pay the most in terms of a carbon tax. On the other hand, if you looked at how our employment is distributed in Oregon, you can see that transportation, even though it emits the most greenhouse gases, it actually employs the fewest people of these four sectors. So only 2% of employment in Oregon is made up of that transportation sector. And our largest sector here is commercial. So if you think about it, then transportation will be paying the most in terms of carbon tax, but because they have the fewest people employed here in Oregon, the employment will potentially not have such a large impact. So let's take a look at what happened in terms of our analysis. So first, up here on the graphs, you'll see that there is a blue line up there, and it says BAU emissions. So that's business as usual emissions. So we assume that going into the future, if everything stayed the same, we have the same policies that we have on the books right now, and anything that will sunset will potentially get renewed, and we'll pretty much have the same policy landscape. So that blue line shows what the greenhouse gas emissions are projected to be going into the future. And then the green line on the bottom shows the 1990 emissions here in Oregon. So Oregon has a goal of getting to 10% below that green line by the year 2020. That's one of our state mandated goals. So, so this red dotted line that you see on here is an example of what we modeled as a $30 per ton carbon tax here in Oregon. And you can see that it lowers greenhouse gas emissions, but it's still pretty far from that green line. And if you up that carbon tax to about $60, we get closer. We get pretty close out in about 2030-ish. And then if we up that even more to see what will we have to do if we were only to institute a carbon tax here in Oregon to get to our goals. And that $100 carbon tax gets us below 1990 emissions levels in around 2030. But that's if you only use the carbon tax as your sole tool to lower and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this gave us an idea that a greenhouse gas emission reduction goal is probably best reached with the carbon tax as one of the many tools in your toolkit. So, all right, so to give you an idea of what are the potential carbon tax revenues that could result. So we modeled many different scenarios, many different levels of carbon taxes, as you might imagine. So this particular scenario is if we started in 2012 at a level of $10 per ton, and then we increased by $5 per year and reached a maximum amount of $60 in 2022. So the revenues that came out were in 2015 about 1.1 billion, goes up to about 2 billion in 2025. So to give you an idea of how large that is and in perspective is that Oregon in our last biennium, so if we took that biennium and divided by 2 and looked at our annual budget, general revenues plus lottery funds is equal to about 7.4 billion. So the carbon tax revenues that we modeled is not insignificant here. So 2.1 out of 7.4 billion. So it's a good amount. So, so we also wanted to figure out, is there potentially something called a double dividend effect that environmental economists like to call a carbon tax? So the double dividend effect is, the first dividend is that if you charge a carbon tax to the market, to the economy, we could potentially make people realize and internalize the actual cost of the carbon to the society. So that's one good thing. The second dividend is that if we potentially use the revenues from the carbon tax and use it to lower other taxes that are potentially distortionary to the market, say like income taxes, for example. So taking taxes away from things that you want and put it on the things that you don't want, like carbon, then potentially we can reach this double dividend effect. So I am going to now turn the table over to my colleague Jeff to continue talking about some of our scenarios about how our revenue might potentially be used.
So I'm going to show you some of the results of our modeling. Just very briefly, I'm going to gloss over how we perform the modeling. We'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you guys want to know more about it. But basically, we took our emissions baseline, we impose a price on carbon, and we estimate what the increase in each fuel type is, and then we estimate people and businesses' reaction to that increase in price. That gives us a new level of fuel demand that's distributed in our model of the Oregon economy. We calculate how much revenue is associated with that, and then we return it to our model, or we repatriate it to the economy, and we look at different ways of doing that. So what we'll show you is the net impact of raising energy prices, and then in most cases cutting different types of taxes, or in some cases targeted expenditures. So our main methods for repatriating the revenue is going to be to consumers, so that's through a cut in the personal income tax rate, to businesses through a cut in the corporate income tax rate, We'll look at specific targeted investments, and then, as was mentioned before, we know that the impact on low-income individuals will be potentially pretty severe. In Oregon, the lowest income quintile spends about 25% of their income on energy-related purchases. The highest income quintile only spends about 4%. So right off the bat, we know that if we're increasing energy prices, the outcome is probably going to be pretty regressive. So we know we need to be concerned about that. So, Jen, if you know, move on. So this is a summary. I'll show you more detailed versions of each of these graphs, but we're starting with this one because this shows the net employment impact for several of the scenarios that we looked at. And for us, the real takeaway is even when you look at our most extreme scenarios, so a positive impact of just under 5,000 jobs and then a negative impact of a little bit under 4,000, that's for the total Oregon economy, right? So Oregon has 1.6 million jobs. So when we're talking about the economic impact of this policy, we're talking about fractions of a % of employment change. So what we find and what we see in other parts of the world that have implemented carbon pricing is that the economic impact doesn't need to be large, right? And in some cases, it can even be a small positive impact. So generally, this sort of old conventional wisdom that people want to do something about the environment, but it's necessarily going to destroy the economy, we don't find evidence to support that. If we want to go to the next one. So we'll start with what we call our extreme scenarios. So in this one, we look at, we collect the revenue, and then we dedicate 100% of that revenue to cutting corporate income tax rates. So in this case, we would actually eliminate the corporate income tax, and then we'd still have some money left over. So in this scenario, we're imagining that corporate income taxes are eliminated, and then businesses get an additional business tax credit, basically. So what we see is this is our most positive employment impact. The total effect in 2015 is a little bit over 4,000 jobs, and then that rises to a little bit over 8,000 in 2025. This distribution across sectors that we have at the bottom here, so it's residential in the green, industrial in the red, commercial in the blue, and then transportation in the purple. This basically holds true. So we find that residential and industrial are going to be pretty close to a net zero impact. They'll go kind of to either side of that zero line, depending on how revenues are repatriated. But these, even in our extreme scenarios, we're talking about 0.3% of employment in these sectors. The commercial sector tends to do pretty well in all of these, and as Jenny showed us earlier, the commercial sector tends to have a huge amount of employment in Oregon, and it's responsible for a fairly small amount of the emissions. So just their increase in their energy costs are going to be relatively small. Their benefit associated with a cut in the corporate tax rate is going to be significant, so they end up better off. The transportation sector, we see consistently negative effects, but we should note in this study, we included some pass-through effects. So we had some elements of these industries interacting with each other within our modeling. We know that there's some interaction, there's some passing on of prices that the transportation sector will do that we're not capturing here. So we do show negative employment impacts, but it's probably bigger than it would be in reality. And we can talk about how we've improved on that in our new work. So then let's go to our other extreme. So this is using 100% of the revenue for personal income tax cuts. Again, we're talking about a pretty small negative impact relative to the size of the Oregon economy. And what's motivating this is giving money to individuals. Most individuals are just going to turn that into consumption, right? Most of what Oregonians consume is not produced here, right? So it might increase welfare, but some of that positive economic impact is just going to leak out of the state. So that's what we see here. We're just not seeing Oregon residents generate enough additional economic activity to offset the negative effect of increasing energy prices. But like we say, it's we're still operating in a very thin band here. So then we have two scenarios here where we think that these balance a desire for significant emissions reductions and then reasonably good economic outcomes. So for this scenario, we looked at taking 10% of our revenues and reinvesting it into energy efficiency projects. We also calculated the net impact on each income level in Oregon. So as expected, we find that after the increase in energy prices and after the personal income tax rates cuts, Oregonians making less than about $35,000 per year end up worse off than they were before. So there's a net negative impact on incomes for those households. Everyone else tends to do better than they were before. So to offset this, we looked at the revenues going to households making $100,000 or more, and we just took enough of that revenue to offset the negative impacts for households making less than $35,000 a year. And what we find is that the economic impacts associated with that low-income assistance are actually more positive than they are if you just do an even cut in the tax rate. And that's basically because lower-income people have economists say they have a higher marginal propensity to consume. That just means if you give a low-income person money, they're probably going to spend it right away because the next dollar they're going to spend is going to be on rent or food or something important like that. Wealthier people, they'll get an additional dollar. Some of it will go to savings, some of it will go wherever. So there's generally better economic outcomes if you assist low-income people. And then if we could go to our last one. So then this one, we look at using 25% of the revenues for industrial energy efficiency projects, residential energy efficiency, and then also we were thinking about transportation-related investments. So you could think about this as investments in public transportation. And then we use the rest of the income to cut personal and corporate income taxes, and we include our low-income assistance. And what's nice about this one is it sort of evens out the distribution of the costs and the benefits across our industries. So we take the commercial down below what it is. Industrial in this case is slightly positive, but this would be an effective way to use some of that revenue to target industries that are negatively impacted by the tax. So I'm going to hand it over to Jenny to talk about what we're currently working on, but it's just a quick summary. It seems clear to us, based on looking at actual real-world examples of carbon pricing, and then the results of our economic modeling and others who have done economic modeling, is you can have significant carbon reduction, and at the same time you can have small positive economic impacts, or at the very least you can sort of hold your economy harmless. It's really important what you do with the revenue, right? So if you do something unproductive with those revenues that come in, you could potentially have negative economic outcomes. But as long as you're doing something that's going to incentivize more economic activity, you could end up better off than you were before. We consistently see that if you want positive employment impacts, cutting corporate income taxes needs to be some part of your revenue use mix. We say personal income tax is less important there, less important from the perspective of motivating economic activity, but from an equity perspective, extremely important. Commercial sector, we expect them to do well. Transportation sector, as you would expect from a very energy-intensive sector, it's probably going to be negatively impacted. And distributional impacts are really important. So some sort of plan needs to be incorporated into the policy to offset some of that. So I'll hand it back to Jen.
All right, so really quickly to go over what we have been working on for the past many months is that as part of Senate Bill 306, we were tasked with looking into this basically with more depth and more detail. So Alright, so originally when we did our first study, we were only able to look at all of Oregon as a whole, whereas in the second study, we were able to break Oregon down into 6 geographic regions that kind of made sense to tell the story of what could happen. And breaking this down into 6 geographic regions gave us the ability to, for example, figure out what would be the increase in electricity prices that would be different for each of these geographic regions depending on who was their provider for electricity. And so we were able to also figure out what are the geographic impacts to different industries, as well as look at what would happen also to a broader range of lower income households. In addition to that, we also are able to break down the Oregon economy into 70 sectors instead of just the 4 really broad sectors that we saw before. So now we're able to more confidently say, well, what could happen to, say, one of our outdoor gear and activewear industries that is pretty big here in Oregon, and be able to see where would we want to target, say, repatriation of the revenue. So it's a pretty long process. This is kind of our general overall modeling schematic. Basically, you take carbon taxes, you feed it into the system, figure out what are the price increases across the board for various fuel types. That feeds into our economic model, which is the orange rubbing model in the middle. And then we have some physicists also from Portland State University helping us out. So we have some calculation. We basically built an Oregon greenhouse gas emissions model that vary by region, by industry, that take the inputs from our economy. And then we can from there calculate what would be the revenues that are generated, and then feed those back into revenue usage scenarios, which are much more complicated and much broader than we were able to do in our first study. And also in that process, we engaged in a lot of stakeholder outreach, so we've been talking to a lot of low-income folks, we've been talking to labor groups. We also have a really great technical advisory committee that's made up of pretty much all of the agencies that have anything to do with the carbon tax. So transportation people, utilities people, basically everyone you can think of. And so that really helped us, really informed a lot of the details of our study and basically gave us a more realistic framework to work with for this time around. So look out for that on December 8th, I think. That study will be released to the legislature. And so I think that's it. And if you are interested in reading in its entirety our first study, it is available on our website, and it's there in full color. Thank you.